When Redfall was announced and compared to Left 4 Dead but vampires, I was like, okay, I guess. Multiplayer shoot 'em up isn't really what I look for in an Arkane game. When creative director Ricardo Bear said to Games Radar, Redfall isn't like those games at all. Redfall is more like loading into Far Cry. I was even more skeptical. I haven't loved a Far Cry game since Far Cry 2, better than Far Cry 3, don't at me. I wasn't sure that an open world game where you run around and clear icons on a map is what I wanted or expected from Arkane. Arkane are known for making immersive sims with unique worlds and some of the best level design in gaming. Making an open world game without that design structure and a multiplayer game at that. I played a bit over 90 minutes of Redfall and I can safely say that the Arkane that I love is still there and I definitely wanted to play more. Let me know any questions you have in the comments and I'll get back to you. So Arkane Austin is leading the development of Redfall, the studio that last did Prey, whereas Arkane Lyon did Deathloop. Redfall is an open world co-op RPG at its core, which yes, maybe that is like a Far Cry, but I think they're selling Redfall short. Far Cry games are not RPGs, despite what the marketing will tell you. Redfall has 4 distinct characters to choose from. Layla, the biomedical engineer with telekinetic powers. She can lift you or enemies up with her elevator or protect you with an umbrella that soaks up damage and hits targets back with it. Or for her ultimate, she summons her ex-boyfriend who is now a vampire and will fight for you for a short period of time. You've got Devinda, a cryptozoologist with paranormal technical abilities. The arc javelin that electrifies enemies, Translocate, which is just Blink from every Arkane game you've ever played, and Blacklight, which is like a massive UV beam in front of you. Remy, the combat engineer with the robot companion, acts as kind of like a support, having a C4 charge ability that is just a bomb. Siren, which will make the robot companion distract enemies, and Mobilize, which can summon allies. Jacob is a former military sharpshooter that can become entirely invisible with Cloak or summon their Raven to ping enemies, and their ultimate Heartstopper will allow you to auto-target and destroy enemies with his sniper. Once you've picked your characters, you also have a massive skill tree to improve your abilities and passives to make a build that is truly your own. So there is a true RPG with progression and systems to interact with here, more akin to a Borderlands than a Far Cry. But I also don't think it's a Far Cry open world. One of the key elements of Far Cry open worlds is a map littered with chores to complete before you can really do anything, and Redfall's map and objectives here are very tame, and the icons don't appear on your compass until you're close to them to actually interact with them to encourage exploration. So if Redfall's not a Far Cry, what is it? Well, it's an Arkane game.
I know you're here. Ghost it out. Give yourself to me.
I don't find you, then they will.
For the preview, we were dropped about 30% through the main story at about level 7, and we were playing on PC, so we had some skills here to play around with being level 7, and all the footage that you're watching, by the way, is provided B-roll. We weren't allowed to capture any of our own footage, so most of this footage will be from Devinda's perspective, as that was the B-roll provided. However, I played as Jacob. I mentioned Jacob's ability earlier, but he is basically like a ghost sniper. You've got abilities like the Cloak to make you invisible, the Raven to ping the enemies, and then taking them out with his silent sniper rifle. The first thing I did with the skills was invest into the Cloak ability, which allowed me to shoot while cloaked and not actually removing the Cloak ability. And I kind of used this as a get out of jail free card in a lot of encounters, as you can cloak during combat and avoid enemies, which made playing solo like we did in the preview much easier. So we started in the fire station, which is the central safe house where you can talk to NPCs, merchants, grab side quests, and do that sort of usual stuff. Now I set out heading southwest towards the main mission, which was to explore Dr. Addison's lab at his mansion to learn more about the vampire apocalypse that's taken over the island. The first thing I noticed is that there is stuff happening all over the place. There are cultists around, vampires, things to explore and do everywhere that I looked on the map. I employed a stealthy long-range approach, as it's kind of like the purpose of Jacob's kit, using stealth and picking enemies and taking out enemy silence. The first thing I noticed is with vampires, you have to stake them to actually finish them off. So by staking them, which essentially what that means is you have to run up to melee range with them and hit them in the heart with a stake. Now, as a ranged character like Jacob, this was a little bit challenging because I was taking out enemies from a distance and didn't want to have to run up and do that. And this is where the stake launcher came really handy, which was a weapon that as it describes, launches stakes at enemies. So I was using that in a lot of encounters to pick off enemies from a distance and then use the stake launcher to either finish them off or actually defeat the vampire. Now, stakes can be on weapons as well. So like an assault rifle or a shotgun will have a stake attachment, so you can whittle the enemy down, and then once they fall into that stake animation encounter, you can stake them. That stake animation has a really good meaty sound to it. That sounds kind of weird, I guess, but it's got a good power fantasy to it, if you kind of know what I mean. Same with the headshot sound. I found the headshot sound immensely satisfying as I was headshotting enemies with Jacob's sniper rifle. So traveling throughout the world, you'll come across cultists, and they're the main cannon fodder, like easy enemies for you to defeat, show off your skills, and just take out simply, similar to the Eternals in Deathloop. A big complaint that I had with Deathloop was these enemies. They were just too easy to defeat or trick, or honestly just completely ignore, as there wasn't enough challenge in that general gameplay flow outside of how you dealt with the visionaries and how you chose to tackle those bigger situations. Redfall solves this issue not only with the multiple difficulty options, but mainly the vampire enemies and their variety. So in my playthrough, I came across your standard vampires. I came across watchers, which act basically like cameras. They sit up on high grounds, and you can defeat them while they're up there, but they'll alert enemies to your presence. These blood bag enemies that exploded. There was a siphon that siphons your blood, like losing your health. The shroud basically blocks your view of like everything around you, so you can only like see like maybe a meter or so in front of you, and the Rook, which we'll talk about a little later. So there's plenty of different vampires and variety to these enemies that you need to actually pay attention to what's happening. A couple of times I tried to just John Wick my way through encounters, and the vampires quickly became heavily aggressive and took me out when I wasn't being cautious or controlled in my approach. I was just charging into the center of the action and seeing what happened.
Give 'em hell. You got any gross-ass freaks?
So on the way to the mission, I unlocked a safe house by turning on the power and took out a vampire nest. These vampire nests were actually one of the highlights of the preview for me. So they're like mini dungeons where you enter an alternative like world space that is different each nest. So they have like modifiers that will change the vampires or the encounter themselves, say for adding like elite vampires that are much harder, or maybe a certain type of vampire will appear more often in this one. And with these little encounters, you go to the end of the area, you defeat the vampires, take out the heart, then there's a short window where you can go around and explore and collect any of the loot in these like heart chamber spaces. The loot is a big part of Redfall, and collecting the loot from these encounters. So similar to Deathloop, you do have weapons that you will collect across your journey, and they'll have different rarities depending on what does actually drop for you. These weapons can have alternative like buffs on them, as well as just the overall damage and things that they will do. I did find a couple of interesting weapons throughout my playthrough, and I really enjoyed tinkering with the different weapons. I think my favorite was the UV beam, which like froze the vampires in front of me and then just allowed me to like punch them to death because they were frozen and they exploded. It was a good time. At this point, really, I was thinking more closely akin to a Borderlands game, and I could kind of see where that Far Cry label was coming from. It wasn't until I got to the mansion that I really felt like this was an Arkane game. So I get to the mansion, and it's this big mansion kind of in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by vampires of different types that required me to take out that situation in a certain way. So there were watcher vampires guarding the entrance, a siphon walking around the main door, and then various other vampires littered around the rooftop. To me, this is where that Arkane level design really started to shine, because I immediately started thinking about how I was going to tackle this situation using the abilities that were available to Jacob's kit that I had, and which way that I would tackle this situation. And depending on the character you were playing, that would be different. You wouldn't play this as a stealth sniper if you weren't playing as Jacob. If you're playing as Remy with her robot companion, you'd probably use that to distract the enemies and then use that to your advantage. Whereas I used the Raven to ping the enemies, used the sniper to take out the watchers and enemies that I could from a distance before I got up close and personal and actually entered into the mansion. Arkane have given these skills that act as tools for you to interact with these environments that are around you and how you choose to tackle the scenarios, as well as the weapons and the effects on those weapons. And that is the core of that decision-making process that are often found in these immersive sims, and where I felt that this is closer, more akin to an immersive sim than a open world Far Cry game. So avoiding any spoilers here, the mission objective was very Arkane as well. It was to search the house, find the lab, and then I had to hunt down the daughter's room, find these 3 dolls, use the dollhouse houses to be transported into an alternate dimension of the mansion with echoes of the past and what he had been doing as part of his research. And this is very arcane in its structure, getting transported into a different reality, having to hunt down objectives and keys to open certain doors or find certain ways inside different rooms. That also felt very arcane to me. So after the mission, you get a cutscene that is different depending on the character you play, as it's that character recapping those events and what they think and feel about the situation that's happening on the Redfall island. And that'll be different depending on the different characters. So there's a little bit of replayability choice there. So after the mission, I went back into the open world, did some side quests, as well as explored some more nests, as that was the kind of content that I was really enjoying. With any of these actions that you complete in the open world, a kind of threat meter will fill up that once this is full, the vampire gods will summon the Rook Vampire. Now this is like a mini boss that is quite challenging, and he will essentially just spawn and the world will go all orangey and red with lightning all around you, and you have to fight him off. After I completed the safe house mission, I unlocked the mission to take out the underboss that was controlling that region of the open world. These underbosses control a specific region of the map, and once you've completed the certain missions in that area, you can take them on to like overthrow that area. I believe the underboss was in the museum, though I might be forgetting the name of the location, but I traveled there and fought the underboss as well as his underlings as he protected them with sort of like a shield barrier that required me to take out the barrier before I could actually defeat the enemy. Now this also changed the way that I played because of my Jacob playstyle of playing from ranged and playing stealthily. I couldn't just one-shot these enemies and avoid, breaking my stealth because of the barrier that was protecting them. This forced a different playstyle out of myself to tackle the situation in a different way. One of my biggest concerns with Redfall was the weapon variety, as well as ammo. For some reason, I was always running out of ammo. That is easily fixed. However, the weapon variety, I'm not sure. So throughout my time, I had a stake launcher, a flare gun, the UV beam, sniper rifle, shotgun, assault rifle, and pistol. Those weapons I had throughout my time, and I found variations of these of different rarities. However, once I had a copy of the weapon that I liked, I didn't feel the need to switch to any of the other weapons that I found. Now, Borderlands solves this looter shooter issue by just randomizing all the weapons, and you can find all sorts of nonsense that can do all sorts of crazy things. Redfall is trying to accomplish this with different weapon effects, but whether this will make meaningful changes to builds, as well as a desire to try and find new weapons, is yet to be determined, and we'll have to wait until we get further into the game when the game actually does come out on May 2nd. I came away from my time with Redfall with a much clearer vision to what this title is. It is, at its core, an RPG FPS shooter with some immersive sim, co-op, and open world elements. There's a lot here, and I'm intrigued to see if Arkane can pull off their entire vision. Also, I want to thank Bethesda ANZ for inviting me to the preview. This is the first ever preview event I've attended, and it was for a game that I was genuinely interested in playing so that I could understand more. And I also want to thank you guys, the community that watch my content. I wouldn't be given opportunities like this without you, and that's definitely not lost on me, so I appreciate you all. I hope I've provided value to you, and I'll definitely have more Redfall content as we get closer to launch. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.